all of you for joining me for this session today. On behalf of ICMAI Social Auditors Organization, I welcome you all. Every project, when it is planned with a defined objective, defined purpose in terms of output, outcome, and impact. And so is the case with social projects also. Whenever someone decides to plan a social program, intervention, or a project, it is with a specific purpose of a particular objective being achieved, a particular impact being created on a particular set of group of people or a particular specific geographical area. But once the project is implemented and it starts operating at the ground level, there is a need for carrying out social impact assessment, basically with a view to finding out what is the actual impact as compared to the kind of impact that we had envisaged, the kind of impact that we had expected, intended when we planned the program in the first instance. And for that purpose, we carry out what is technically known as social impact assessment. So, social impact assessment is a process of analyzing, monitoring, and identifying the impacts of social intervention or program, which could be both positive or negative, on the ground level with a view to finding out whether any social change has happened at the ground, with a view to ensuring ourselves as well as all the other stakeholders that this project is operating at the ground level, delivering the expected, intended outcomes and impact to the various beneficiaries of a particular program. But then to look at output, it could be probably slightly simpler. To look at the outcome, also probably a simpler way of looking at what is the outcome of a particular project. But identifying the impact is challenging task. That's because here we are looking at assessing the experience of the people. And as you understand, experience probably cannot be measured. It is felt, it is perceptual, and it is at the level of an individual or economic unit, that is family or household, or it could also be at the level of the society or the community as a whole. And when we talk about experience of a social impact, what we basically mean by that is it involves changes to the way people live their lives at personal level, in professional capacities, keeping in view their beliefs, their customs, their values, their language, and of course, their perceptions. While carrying out social impact assessment, one of the key process step and one of the key challenge that a social impact assessor has to face and deal with is data collection, data analysis, data interpretation, and finally, reporting of all the analysis that the social impact assessor would have carried out with respect to a social project or an intervention. These are key aspects of social impact assessment. In this session today, we're going to talk about how do we do data collection and how do we analyze the data for the purpose of and in the context of social impact assessment. Let's first look at the broad characteristics of social projects or social interventions. All such projects, they have various dimensions, which could be environmental, livelihoods, culture, infrastructure. But at the center point of all these social interventions or social projects lies the core aspect of people's well-being. That is what is the ultimate objective. How do we bring about improvement in the quality of life of the people, people's well-being, or overall holistic development of the human beings is at the core of all social interventions or social projects. So we need to collect data pertaining to a particular social project or intervention with the objective of assessing as to what extent the project has been able to create and deliver the expected, desired output, outcome, and impact at the ground level. In fact, data collection is nothing specific peculiar to the process of social impact assessment. Data collection is an essential phase in all types of research and analysis. So you need to have data picked up, pulled up from the grassroots level relating to a particular social intervention or social project, which then you will analyze, interpret, and then come out with your report as to what is the actual impact of a social intervention or the social project on the target beneficiaries or a particular geographical area which was targeted at the time when the social intervention was initially conceived and planned. So as a first step, you need to answer three basic questions before you actually set out to collect the data for the purpose of carrying out social impact assessment. The first thing that you got to be very, very clear is what is the objective or goal of social impact assessment. Second thing you got to keep in mind is what kinds of data would be relevant for social impact assessment so that you can accordingly plan to gather and collect specific relevant data which will further the quality of your research as well as the studies that you are carrying out in terms of social impact assessment. And the third aspect to be looked at would be what methods and procedures should I follow for collecting data, keeping it aside, storing the data for a certain period of time. How do I analyze that particular data or process that information from the data that you would have collected? So I have to identify what particular methods and procedures of data collection you should use for the purpose of social impact assessment. Of course, we know that there are two kinds of data. Quantitative, which is referred to and reflected in terms of numbers, comparatively easier to deal with. And then you have qualitative. How do you say that the life of a particular group of people has benefited, improved as a result of a social intervention. You may not have any direct indicator or matrix. Probably you may have to go for some kind of proxy metrics or proxy indicators. Qualitative data covers descriptions. It could be, for example, color, size, appearance, quality, etc. Whereas quantitative data deals with numbers, the basic statistics that you have, which can be reflected and dealt with in very many different ways. You can check out the trends of numbers. You can check out percentage increase, decrease. You can deal with those numbers or the quantitative data in very many different ways, which of course we're going to talk about later in this presentation. So the quality of your social impact assessment exercise is going to depend a lot on how successfully, how carefully, how scientifically you have collected the data and analyzed the same. So for that, it is important to plan and design the data collection techniques in advance. You must use consistent and standardized data formats and definitions. You must also put in place a process to ensure the quality and accuracy of your data. And you are responsible for maintaining and protecting the privacy and confidentiality of your data. And then you must also label your data sources and document the various technologies, the various methods of data collection that you have used for the purpose of carrying out social impact assessment. Data collection approaches determining what is the kind of data which is required to measure the impact of a social intervention or a social project. For determining what kind of data you need, you have to keep at the back of your mind organizations' desired social objectives. What is the key vision of the organization who has implemented a particular social project at the ground level? What is the desired social objective likely to emanate from that project or intervention? And secondly, you got to look at the potential social impact. Objectives are macro level visionary. But when you talk about social impact, that's more specific, directly relatable to a certain group of people who are the beneficiaries, or maybe relating to a certain specific geographical area where a social intervention or social project may have been implemented. And then you have to also consider, look at a broad spectrum of various categories of stakeholders that may have been or may be affected by a social intervention or social project, and who may also influence the outcome and impact of a social intervention or project. Identification of stakeholders is very critical while determining data requirements for measuring impact of a social project. So you have to work out a plan of action where you define your data requirements, then you apply certain methods to collect the data from the field. Once you have the data is required to be sanitized, validated, grouped, classified, stored for a certain period of time. And then you analyze the data by applying various statistical and non-statistical techniques, and then interpret the results, and then put that out in the form of a social impact assessment report. That's how the whole process of SIA is going to flow from defining data requirements to its ultimate culmination in the form of a social impact assessment report. So you have to find out and collect data, but more importantly, you are looking at and you have to consider and identify what and which is the relevant data. No point collecting data of all kinds from the ground level, which ultimately may not be useful at all or may not be able to contribute to your assessment of the impact pertaining to a social intervention or social project. It is much better that you spend some time, think through carefully, identify what and which is the relevant data for social impact assessment of a particular social project. Broadly speaking, you got to check out the relevant domain, the target beneficiaries, underserved, less privileged people belonging to a particular society strata, a particular target beneficiary group. Then you have to identify relevant demographics. If you are going ahead with a social intervention or a social project pertaining to water, it is something which is going to be benefiting the various stakeholders at the grassroots level, women, men, children, all age groups. So that we got to be very careful. What are the relevant demographic profiling data or data points which need to be considered while planning to identify the relevant data set for carrying out social impact assessment? Relevant time period is very important. When we carry out financial audit, we always look out a defined time period. If this is a statutory audit, we are looking for audit pertaining to the period from 1st April 2023 ending on 31st of March 2024. If you are carrying out internal audit, possibly a company may be doing internal audit on a quarterly basis. So still, if you are doing audit now in May, probably you are looking at the data pertaining to the quarter January to March. I mean, that's where we got to be careful in identifying the relevant time period classification in respect of which and in the context of which the social impact assessment is being attempted by a social impact assessor. Finding out and identifying relevant data is critical, because if the data is not relevant, it will render our study maybe useless, maybe less useless, maybe it might even render our whole process of study as obsolete, and this could lead to and leave us in the midst of incomplete research or analysis. So you must look at data which is a valid data, which is reliable, which is verifiable, which can be measured. We have to look at data which is relevant, directly linked, connected to the objectives of the program or social intervention. Technically feasible. As a researcher, as a social impact assessor, you may want to have various kinds of data and information which may technically not be feasible at the ground level. The data should be usable. Indicators, metrics that you have chosen for the purpose of carrying out social impact assessment should be understandable and should help and facilitate you in arriving at your conclusions with regard to comparison between intended impact and the actual impact at the ground level. Time is very critical. How much time do you have at your disposal with a view to be able to complete the data collection, data analysis, data interpretation, and of course the reporting cycles. It has to be cost effective. Entire exercise of data collection, data analysis has to be carefully assessed in terms of the cost benefit analysis. And yes, it has to be ethical. The collection and use of metrics and indicators has to be acceptable to all the people who are actually going to be providing that information, and it must be within the context of a particular culture, value system of that particular group of people, target beneficiaries, or a strata of the society. So when you start looking at the step of deciding the data to collect, you must choose the subjects from where the data would be collected, who you are going to talk to, sources from where the data will be gathered. This could also be either a primary source or a secondary source. A primary data is one which is collected by carrying out original research at the ground level, whereas secondary data is something which you access and source from existing information, existing data sets. Both the types of data, primary and secondary, are important and critical for overall holistic social impact assessment of a social intervention or project. And then quantity. How much information do you require? Very important, because quantity will determine how much time is going to be involved in collection of data, and also the complexity of analysis, and of course the cost which is going to be involved in collecting data from large set of people, large population. Therefore, quantity also is required to be kept in mind while deciding from where and how to collect data for carrying out social impact assessment. We have to also be careful to note the price of each extra data point. It's very easy for the researcher, for social impact assessors, to think that more data that I'm able to gather, the better is going to be my assessment of a project. Well, this may not always be true in real sense, because each extra data point that you look at, each extra data that you're going to collect is going to cost you some money, as well as it's going to involve some time of your team members, of yourself, and that's where we have to arrive at a balance or harmonization of the objectives of impact assessment, the quantity of data that needs to be collected for the same, the time that we have at our disposal, and of course, the budget that we have kept for the purpose of carrying out social impact assessment. So the key steps in data collection process are: decide what data you want to gather. Who are the people from whom this data will be collected? What is the time period for collection of this data? What are the sources that we're going to use for collection of data pertaining to a social project? And then you set a deadline for data collection. That means how many days, how many weeks do you think you should be spending on collection of data? Because this is only one of the phases of social impact assessment process. And therefore, you can't keep on doing data collection endlessly. It has to be within a defined time frame. There are various techniques of data collection, which we're going to talk a little later. Keeping in view the objectives, keeping in view the spread, scatter characteristics of the population, you have to decide and identify a particular data collection approach which you are going to follow for collection of data relating to a particular social project or intervention. While deciding what kind of data you need for carrying out social impact assessment, it is helpful to look at the three basic questions. What kind of details should I look for which will enable me, which will facilitate social impact assessment of a project? What details are available? That's where you will find a gap. Ideally speaking, you may like to get as much data, as much information as possible with regard to different dimensions of the operations of a particular project. But unfortunately, realistically speaking, all that data and information may not at all be available at the ground level. So you must also be very, very careful to understand, appreciate, accept what is the data which is actually available possibly at the ground level. And then out of a whole lot of data which is going to be available at the ground level, you also need to think through what specific details you require, which will facilitate your analysis of data and help you to arrive at a realistic, fair assessment of the social impact delivered by a particular social project. So there are two different kinds of data that we have to look at: primary data and secondary data. Some of the common techniques that we use for data collection involve interviews and surveys using questionnaires. But of course, time consuming and expensive. Even for relatively small amount of data, if you have to carry out interviews and surveys, is going to be time consuming as well as an expensive exercise. And therefore, normally, as part of any research that you do, we normally resort to and depend upon the concept of sampling. We identify a certain minimum set of people who we are going to interact with, talk to, with a view to getting a sense as to what is the impact at the ground level of a particular social intervention or project, instead of looking at and collecting data from the entire population. We look at collecting the information and data from a specific set of people, a certain number of people, based upon the considerations of determining an effective, reliable sample. We're going to talk about that more little later. So you want to carry out social impact assessment. How do you do that? You'll be able to do that once you have some kind of data. Now, what kind of data would be useful for carrying out social impact assessment? The data which reflects certain yardsticks, certain indicators, certain metrics, which will help you to measure the impact of a social project at the ground level. So it's very important to define your matrix. Matrix should be which can be measured, which is acceptable universally as part of a broad definition. And then once we have been able to identify relevant metrics for social impact assessment, you will then have to prioritize and categorize your indicators based on the dimensions of relevance and timeliness. And it is there the two important aspects of social impact assessment, logic model and the theory of change, are going to be very, very important to understand. How each step involved in a social project or social intervention is connected with the ultimate outcome based on the selected matrix and selected yardsticks and indicator that has to be properly understood, and the linkage has to be properly identified with a view to mapping your inputs and activities with the outputs, the outcomes, the impacts. Everything has to be connected together and mapped by using reliable and relevant metrics or indicators. You can also probably look at Balanced Scorecard given by Robert Kaplan, which says if you want to analyze the performance of any organization, it is not only financial performance that matters. That's one of the dimensions, but you should also be looking at other non-financial dimensions of the performance of an organization with a view to arriving at a holistic assessment with regard to performance of an organization at a given point of time. You must identify the audience and also the type of data that you would like to collect from a particular group of people. Maybe in some cases, you will notice that the questionnaire that you have developed, the kind of questions that you have incorporated in the questionnaire may be slightly different for men as compared to women. Quite possible. Many a time it happens. It may also be different depending upon the age group of the people with whom you're going to interact for the purpose of collecting the data required for social impact assessment. And then you have to map your entire data collection process, at least first on paper. Document that entire data collection process before you actually start putting it out in the marketplace as a real life game plan. Map your entire data collection process, how the data will be collected, how the collected data will be interpreted and used effectively for the purpose of arriving at conclusions with regard to social impact assessment. Once you have mapped your data collection plan, that's the time whereafter we're going to actually put that out into action and begin gathering data. Even after the process of data collection has started, we got to carefully keep looking at how the process is going. Is it going and doing the process as per the intended action plan? And as circumstances may change during the process of carrying out social impact assessment, we may also need to amend our data collection plan in between. And therefore, we must always keep and always have at the back of our mind that kind of flexibility which is required in any research project, including social impact assessment. So what are the different data collection methods? First, we are going to look at the data collection methods for collecting primary data. Primary data is the data which is collected from the source of data by way of direct intervention or interaction with the respondents. This data allows the researchers to obtain first-hand information which is specifically connected, tailored to the research objectives. And for collection of data of primary nature, there are various techniques that we normally use and follow. And these techniques are surveys and questionnaires. It's very common in any kind of research action plan that we may decide to carry out a survey by floating a questionnaire amongst the target group of people. Questionnaire can have various kinds of questions. Some of the questions could be multiple choice. Some of the questions could be open-ended. Some of the questions could be yes, no, and yes, why not. At times, some of the questions may require the respondents to write a few words or write a few lines by themselves. Open-ended question. The questionnaire has to be carefully built up. It should not include any question which is of personal nature, which might breach the privacy of the respondent. It should not hurt their sentiments. It should not hurt their culture, human values. But at the same time, it has to be comprehensive enough with a view to be able to capture the entire set of data which you require for carrying out social impact assessment. Then you may go for interviews. You may talk to people one-on-one. You may talk to some people over telephone. You may visit the particular place where the social project is being implemented, and you may talk to some people on one-on-one basis. It could also be one on a group. This can be done by way of video conferencing. Interviews has to be structured with predefined questions. It must be structured, yes, but possibly a better interview would be which is semi-structured, which allows flexibility to the interviewers as well as to the respondents to slightly go away from the main focus and provide information pertaining to various dimensions of the project, which could also be very, very useful in social impact assessment. Observations is a very important technique for data collection, especially qualitative data. You go to a place where a social project has been implemented. What do you observe? Just spend some time. Just pull out a chair, sit down under a tree, just watch. There is a water pump, hand pump installed there. Just sit there for 2 hours, 3 hours, watch out. What happens? People come, they draw the water, they come with buckets, they come with bottles, they sit down there, they talk merrily. Are they happy? Are they laughing? I mean, just observe the whole human process in terms of emotions, in terms of feelings, in terms of perceptions, and that can be best done by having a system and a process of observation. Many a time you may also like to carry out an experiment. Let me do a kind of an experiment. Just as you do in the laboratory, social experiments are carried out in the open society. You carry out an experiment where you can manipulate some of the matrix variables with a view to assessing and observing their impact on the outcome. Then you can have focus group meetings, a small group of people put together who discuss specific topics where there is a moderator sitting along, facilitating the entire discussion. This focus group brings you to deal with certain aspects of a project in a more coherent, in a more holistic manner, because it helps you to understand their opinions, their perceptions, based on the talk that you have with that group and the experiences which will be shared by the participants of the target group. So what is a focus group? Let me spend some more time on this particular aspect. Very important technique for primary data collection. Focus group is a kind of an interview-like conversation that happens within small groups, 5 people, 6 people, 10, 12 people, who share a common interest, characteristic, or need. There is a facilitator or a moderator in a focus group meeting. You must first of all gather and collect the names of the participants, identify which particular strata of society they are coming from, what is the composition of the group. Before you start interacting with the focus group, the goal of the focus group must be properly identified, defined, and communicated to them. It's not only important that you are aware about the objective of the focus group meeting, it must also be understood properly by all the participants. Make sure that you tell these people, and you also abide by your own commitment, that all the information that's going to come out from the focus group meeting is going to be kept confidential so that people can freely talk, share their perceptions, share their experiences so as to make the focus group very, very relevant and effective. Before you start the focus group meeting, ask all the people present to introduce themselves to each other. I mean, that helps you to create kind of a bond or get to know each other before you actually start talking about some serious matter. Just ask everyone to introduce themselves to each other before proceeding with the discussion in the focus group meeting. During the focus group activity, provide essential lead questions that will help you to explore answers and also help you capture the response of the participants. Modify your research questions so as to make them more specific to a topic that you want your focus group to interact and deal with. So in the template that you're going to prepare when you carry out a focus group is you must have the respondent information, their name, their gender, where they are coming from, their qualifications, their experience, their other demographic profiles. Introduction, you must have a discussion, concept paper, and then you must have completion. At the end of the focus group, you say a few words to conclude the discussion, and you also ask each one of the participants there to sign the particular sheet of response against their particular name, and that completes the focus group discussion process. You must ask probing questions. In fact, that's a technique that all of us as social auditors will have to develop if we have to become effective social impact assessors. How do you get the relevant information out from the mouth of the people who are participating in the focus group meeting? How do you ensure that you get the right kind of data, right kind of information? So probing questions, why, how, who, when, how often? I mean, these are some of the ideas which can generate a lot of discussion, which can be providing you a wealth of data with regard to a particular social intervention, because these questions are very, very probing. Ask specific questions. What was the result? Who was involved? What to do next? I mean, also verify the responses given by some of the respondents by asking the same question to other respondents or other participants of the focus group. Would you agree with what the other person is saying? I mean, this kind of conversational facilitation is going to be very, very helpful in providing you very useful data in carrying out a focus group meeting. Maybe I can take a separate session on how to interview people for the purpose of carrying out social impact assessment. But here there are some brief examples that we have called out for you. When respondents are vague or have not given adequate information, then you may pose specific probing questions to them. Maybe you can say, what exactly do you mean by this? What specifically will you do next week? Could you tell me more about a particular aspect that you're looking at? Sometimes respondents say things where their purpose is not clear. Ask them to justify their statement. Why did you say that? What were you thinking when you said this? If respondents are going off topic, you must bring them back into the specific discussion. And then probably you can say, interject and say, how is this related to what I asked? Is that relevant to the main question? This is basically with a view to bringing people back to the main topic of discussion rather than letting them go away from the main focus of discussion. In terms of completeness and accuracy, check out, how do you know that this is true? I mean, people, when you pose this question, your respondents are going to give you slightly detailed response or answer, possibly with some examples that might be very useful. How does that compare with what you said before? This is consistency check. A respondent may have made a statement earlier, 15 minutes back, and now he's contradicting himself. You got to check out which one of his statement to believe and rely on. And then you can probably ask a question, how does that compare with what you said 15 minutes before? When respondents talk about something vaguely, you can bring them back into focus. Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Could you help by giving an example? Tell me more about a time when you faced a particular problem. Could you please tell me more about this? And then, of course, what happened after that? To discover how judgmental respondents are, how they evaluate various questions posed in the focus group. You can also pose certain questions to checking their judgment. How do you know it is an relevant question? How do you know it is worthless? What are the advantages, disadvantages, or cost benefits of a particular situation? And how do you feel about that? These are some of the examples of the kind of probing questions which can be very, very effective while carrying out a focus group discussion or a focus group. How do you collect secondary data? Secondary data is which is not collected for the first time. It's already there, embedded in various data sources. You have to just access, pull it out from there, and that's what we call it as the secondary data. The various sources of secondary data can be published sources. You can refer to books, you can refer to reports, academic journals, magazines, newspapers, government reports that might contain relevant data. You also have various online databases which provide you a lot of information, a lot of data, a lot of statistical information. You also have records of various governmental and institutional reports. You have publicly available data which you can gain by maybe through Google or by some other means. And you also have data pertaining to past research studies carried out earlier by some other people pertaining to the same or similar project or a similar geographic territory. Make sure that the data that you are collecting is correct, accurate, reliable, relevant, and timely. Because if your data collection is done incorrectly, it will lead to erroneous conclusions, waste of your time, waste of your resources. Your conclusions may not be relevant, your report may not be of high quality, and it will deceive other researchers who want to venture into carrying out research in a particular area. And the study that you will carry out of a particular social project would not be capable of being replicated or validated if it is based upon incorrect, unreliable, irrelevant data. We face some very, very common challenges in data collection. There are data quality issues. The quality of data may not be up to the mark, may not be as per the expectation. There is challenge of inconsistency of data. The differences could be in terms of formats or units. The data may be ambiguous. The data may be duplicate, overlapping. You would have collected probably one set of data from one source and another set of data from another source, and the data may be duplicated. There could be a lot of overlapping amongst the different data sets. These challenges also are required to be carefully looked at. How do you decide how many people you're going to talk to while carrying out social impact assessment? And that's where we use the concept and technique of survey sampling. Instead of looking at the whole population for collection of data, which is going to be a very, very costly and time-consuming process, you may decide to collect the data from a certain number of people only from the particular population and thus complete your research work, which process is called the survey sampling. there are various methods of carrying out survey sampling. The ideal process of survey sampling is the random sample, where each and every unit has an equal chance of getting selected. And the whole process of selection of sample is very, very random. That's the most ideal process of sampling. But at times, people also go for strategic sampling, purposive sampling. It all depends upon the objectives that you would have kept in your mind while deciding to carry out research based upon a sample and not looking at the full population drawn from a particular territory. You have to also look at what should be the sample size. Is sample size of 10% is going to be adequate? Should I look at a 20% sample size? And while deciding upon the size of the sample, you got to be careful and also consider the cost and the time element. Larger the sample, more time will be involved in carrying out research, more expenses will have to be incurred, and that's where we have to arrive at some kind of a balance between.
Excuse me, Gupta sir.
Yes,
Hello.
please.
There is one or two people, they are not mute and disturbance is coming. Can you please?
I will request all the participants are requested to kindly mute themselves, please. All the participants, kindly mute yourself. We have disturbance coming out from one or two speakers. Thank you so much. Thank you. So while deciding upon the sample size, one is to keep in mind three key factors. Objective of the research. You can't compromise the objectives. Just because it's going to be more time consuming, just because it's going to be more costly, you can't compromise on the objective. Objective of the research has to be met. But besides that, you also got to look at time at your disposal and also resources at your disposal. And of course, the cost that's likely to be involved in carrying out research by using a particular sample size. Like quantitative methodologies, the qualitative analysis depends upon the quality of data, and quality of data also depends upon ability of the researchers to be able to identify right data, relevant data, timely data. You have to look past the superficial. What may appear to be the perception of the people at the ground may not be the reality. I mean, I'm not politicizing the whole thing, but we all looked at the exit poll numbers day before yesterday, and we saw the final result of Lok Sabha polls yesterday. You know what I'm saying, You have to look past the superficial. That means the general perception of some of the people at the ground level may not be able to give you a complete picture or a complete perspective of the impact that a particular social project might make on the ground. Your researchers have to be having the ability to be able to ask probing questions, to be able to judge intensity of feelings. Very important, very difficult. When you say, yes, people of this village are happy that they have got access to water. But then our next question is, how happy are the people? Very, very happy, extremely happy, hugely happy. Happy, just happy. I mean, intensity of the feelings, emotions has to be properly understood by the researchers. And quantitative techniques and the quantitative data is required to be supported, corroborated by qualitative data. That's where the two data sets have to ultimately be matched with one another. We ultimately have to combine the data sources, integrate the different kinds of data sources, both primary data as well as secondary data, so that we can make a holistic picture out of the whole data that we would have collected, so as to be able to carry out appropriate analysis and then interpretation of data. Then coming to the aspect of analysis of data. Once you have collected the data, of course, you'll have to do some kind of sanitation exercise some kind of validation exercise, remove the overlapping duplicate data, remove data which is incomplete, someone has not given a complete answer, you can't take one part of the response only and deal with it subsequently. No, it is better to avoid that particular questionnaire form totally. No point dealing with incomplete data. So analysis of data involves carrying out statistical methods and techniques for analysis of that data with a view to come to certain findings, interpret those findings, identify patterns and trends, and finally draw conclusions about the impact assessment of a particular social program or intervention. But yes, the analysis of data has to be systematic, objective, based on evidence. During the process of data analysis, the data that you have collected is transformed into information and knowledge. Data and information are two different words. Data is raw data. Information is processed data. When the data is processed, it is transformed into information and knowledge. So there is a clear distinction between the word data and information. Information helps you to look at a relationship between different variables and also provide you a basis of identifying and labeling certain meanings to the data and information so that it can be gainfully interpreted for the purpose of arriving at final conclusions. So what are the techniques of data analysis? These are some of the common statistical techniques which are commonly being used in various kinds of research. I hold a PhD in the area of corporate governance. I've carried out research work myself. I'm currently guiding a few research scholars who are pursuing PhD. I'm thickly involved in the process of data collection, data analysis, helping out my scholars who are carrying out research for their PhD. These are some of the common techniques of data analysis which form the part of statistics. We have mean, which is simply the mathematical average of a range of numbers. Then you have median, which is the midpoint. Half the data lies on one side, half the set of data lies on the other side, and this is the median, this is the center point. Mode is the most commonly occurring number in the data set. Standard deviation looks at what is the range or dispersion of the data, quantitative data. Skewness is how symmetrical is the range of distribution of data. Is it a uniform like a bell curve, like a temple bell, or it is tending to move towards a particular direction, and that's what is checked by the concept of skewness in statistics. We also have to make various inferences and predictions from the data analysis that we may carry out. And these are based upon slightly more complicated statistical tests. We can use t-test, which compares the averages of two groups of data to assess whether they are statistically significantly different or not. For example, you float a questionnaire amongst men and you float another questionnaire amongst the women folk. You want to compare, are the responses given by the male respondents and the female respondents more or less same, or are they statistically significantly different? There are tools available by which we can do this kind of an analysis. One of the most common tools that we use for this is called the t-test. We also apply the concept of correlation analysis, which helps you to assess and understand the kind of relationship that exists between two variables or two matrices. If one moves up, the other variable may go down, may move in tandem in the same direction as the earlier variable. These kind of relationships can be established and can be understood by using the concept of correlation analysis. Then we have regression analysis, which is more or less the same as correlation analysis, but it goes one step ahead and helps you to understand the cause and effect between the variables, not just whether they are moving together or not, which is reflected by correlation analysis. Regression analysis helps you to understand the cause and effect between the different variables, and therefore it's a very, very strong inferential technique used in all kinds of research. So we have discussed various methods of data analysis as well as data collection, but we must remember every statistical method has its own assumptions and limitations, so you need to be aware of these. Which particular technique to use in a particular case is going to be a matter of your judgment, reasoned judgment, not subjective judgment. It has to be reasoned judgment. Why do you think this particular approach is going to work better as compared to the other approaches in a given situation? That's where your judgment, your expertise, your ability to carry out quality research is going to come into play. Various techniques of data analysis and data collection that we have discussed, each one of these techniques is based upon different assumptions, different limitations. So while deciding to apply a particular data collection approach or a method, and while deciding to apply a particular data analysis technique, we should be aware about what exactly we are looking at by deploying a particular technique or approach. After you carry out data analysis and interpretation, you will then have to summarize the information to identify the patterns. Summarization process will help you to compare information in a standardized format, relevant format, so that you can prepare tables. You can summarize the results mathematically by using mean, median, mode, standard deviation. And once the information is summarized, you will find it easier to identify patterns. Certain patterns will emerge from the information after analysis. And then you'll be able to interpret meanings, and thus it will help you to close the process of social impact assessment on your part. The next step in the whole process of social impact assessment is data interpretation. You collected the data, you analyzed the data, now you have the results of analysis before you. Now you got to interpret the data. Interpretation involves attaching meaning and significance to the analysis, explaining patterns, explaining relationships and linkages amongst the various variables and dimensions involved in a particular social intervention or a social project. And once the data interpretation is done, the final step for the researcher or for the social impact assessor is to put that in a form of his report by way of interpretations and conclusions. Thank you so very much. That's where I close my formal presentation. But in case there are any questions, any views, any observations, I shall be pleased to interact with you and respond to some of those views and questions. Thank you.
Is it possible to share the PPT, sir?
Absolutely, sir. Presentation will be shared with all the participants by my office, by my coordinator.
Thank you.
Certainly, sir. Thanks a lot.
Namaskar, Dr. Gupta ji. This is
Namaskar, sir.
Rakesh Chaudhary speaking.
Yes, sir. Namaskar, sir.
So I wanted to know more about the data validation. For data validation, data audits is required.
Absolutely, sir. Data validation can be done both manually as well as based upon system. We have certain softwares and other packages now available which facilitate data validation. They will identify what are the common items, which are incomplete items, things like that. But even if not going to the level of IT, even manually, I mean, till now, many of us have been doing data validation manually also. So there are certain important identifiers that we need to identify. Is the data complete in the first instance? Is the data reliable in the second check? Is the data timely in the third check? Is the data relevant in the fourth check? I mean, we can apply these kind of checks with a view to ensuring that data is reliable on which you're going to actually work. carry out analysis, and finally interpret it. The data, just to give me a minute, the data is also likely to be biased at times. I mean, people may give you a different view, which is not the view that they actually hold in their mind, but to a question that you may have posed to them, they will probably try to give you a vague answer or a biased answer. How do you eliminate the biasness? One of the methods that we use is when you construct a questionnaire, put maybe 20, 25, 30 questions there. Some of the questions are questions which are help you or which will help you to cross check. Same question which you want to ask to a respondent, put that one time in a positive frame, and the same question second time, you put that in the negative frame after 10, 15 questions down the line. So if the person gives you conflicting answers in the earlier question and the later question, you know that he is being biased. He is not trying to be very, very clear, open in his mind. He is trying to fool you around probably, and therefore you got to check out whether there are some contradictions in the data that you would have collected. So that's a challenging aspect, but there are techniques available. Maybe we can have a separate session on dealing with data validation and how to deal with biases involved in data collection. That's really going to be very useful for all of us.
Secondly, data will require a document identification number for that registration of document registrations with data centers, with regulatory bodies.
Not necessarily, sir. If you are carrying out private research in the sense that you, as a social impact assessor, are carrying out research of a social impact assessment for a social project, and you've been engaged by a particular NGO or a social enterprise, this is a work which is being carried out by you as a consultant, as an engagement researcher with respect to that particular NGO, and it doesn't go up to the macro or the broad level of you're required to get to yourself enrolled, registered with some databases, with some registry. I don't think that should be required. This may probably be required if you're looking at carrying out social impact assessment of something like Manrega or various other government schemes which are going on in the marketplace. Yes, for that, there is a laid down process of identification of you as a researcher and getting yourself enrolled, registered with a particular data set or repository or regulator.
Certainly, statistical testings are required of data.
Yes, sir.
So one can go for newer areas of analysis of variance, ANOVA analysis of data and all.
Absolutely. I think I'm planning to do another session on data analysis specifically, dealing out with each one of these techniques in detail. Because some of us would have used these techniques in some kind of research work, but many of us may yet be uninitiated. So I want to help everyone understand how do we apply your t-test, how do we do ANOVA, how do we do correlation, regression. I think I'm going to plan future sessions where I'm going to deal in detail with these techniques of data analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So thank you so much, all the participants, for joining us this evening in the webinar organized by ICMAI Social Auditors Organization on data collection and data analysis in the context of social impact analysis. And we have lined out a number of series of programs going forward in the coming week as well as weeks thereafter. And hopefully we look forward to your cooperation, your joining us in subsequent programs of ICMAI SEO also.